there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, part 2 of our heavy-duty floating shelf build. Well, if you remember from last week, we had finished off with making these frames for our floating shelves. And they were basically assembled using brad nails and glue. Really nothing fancy, but quick and efficient, and it really does a great job of holding everything together. Now what we need to do is move on to making the shell that will be around this frame that gives it its finished look. And for that, we're going to be using some 1/2-inch ply with a maple finish on both sides. So let's head over to the table saw and cut some pieces for these floating shelves. Well, knowing that our shelves are 22 inches across really makes it easy to figure out the size of your plywood. It's 22 inches, and we've already said that the depth is going to be 10 inches. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut this ply to its 22-inch dimension. Now the next dimension that you want to cut, that you have this all cut to 22 inches long, is you now want to cut it 10 inches wide for each shelf. And you're going to need 2 inches of this ply for each shelf. So for me, I'm making 4 of them. So 4 pieces for me at 10 inches by 22. For you, whatever size or number you're doing, you can adjust accordingly. But for me, pieces of 10 inches wide now that we have it at 22 inches long. Now you may have noticed the use of some painter's tape while cutting. And the purpose for that is it can really go a long way to preventing chipping along the edge of the veneer that's on the top of this maple plywood. You really don't want chipping at the edges. So, you know, it's not going to eliminate it, but it sure as heck is going to help reduce it. And, you know, it'll make it practically eliminate it. So just a little tip for you, a little bit of blue painter's tape there can help with the chip out. So you've got your 2 pieces here of 1/2-inch ply, 10 inches by 22 inches, and essentially the assembly of these shelves is something as simple as this. So this will mount like so, and this here will go on top of that piece like so, and that will get glued and clamped together. Now, that's butt ugly in the front. Look at that. Well, that's because we still have edging to make and put on it, but there's still a few more steps that we need to do, and we're going to get into that, and I'm going to explain to you now why it is we need to do these steps. Well, I've got the plywood pieces temporarily clamped to our frame, and this is the back that will be against the wall. And I'll show you the problem here, and it's not a problem because I anticipated it, but it's a problem if you don't correct it. When the bracket slides into our shelf, you can see that the bracket is actually going to sit proud of the shelf. And that really isn't acceptable because we want this shelf to be flush against the wall. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to run a rabbet on the inside edge of each of these pieces of plywood on the back side, and the rabbet is going to be 5/16 of an inch deep, and the depth really doesn't matter as long as it's more, or the width rather doesn't matter, as long as it's more than the 1/4 inch that this steel is thick. That way this bracket will actually recess inside of this piece. So I'm going to set up the dado blade at the table saw, and we're going to run some rabbets on the edges of these plywood boards, and I'll show you what it is exactly that I'm talking about. So I've cut the rabbet on the back inside edge of each piece, and they ended up being 5/16 of an inch deep, and they're 3/8 of an inch wide. So I'm just going to clamp this back together so you can see what purpose that rabbet serves. And it basically makes it so that the shelf can sit flush to the wall. Now, it will be hidden by our outer trim of these shelves, so you don't need to worry about doing a stopped rabbet or anything like that, or hiding it. You can see that it's open here at the ends. That's all going to get hidden by the trim, so I'm not too concerned. But at least now you can see that when we put this shelf on the wall, we have the opportunity here for this shelf to sit completely flush and tight to the wall, because now our bracket is completely recessed into the back of our shelf, and that's the way it should be. So there you go. You want to make sure that you cut that rabbet in each one of these pieces. Well, the next step now that you have this temporarily clamped together is to measure the thickness here of your shelf, and in my case it's 2 1/8 inch. And if you are following along with the measurements, yours should be 2 1/8 as well. We need to cut or mill some hardwood now that's going to go around the outer edges, the two sides and the front. And for that, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch maple. So let's mill some 1/2 inch maple, and then we're going to come back and start making the trim that goes around the front visible edges of our shelf. Well, I've milled my stock, and I've actually changed it to a 3/8 thickness, and it was for no other reason than that's what I had in the rack. It was some leftover pieces from a different project, so why not use them up? So now the next part in the process is to cut your pieces for your outer hardwood trim, and I'm going to be mitering the corners of mine. So you need to cut a piece for the front and for both sides mitered at the front corner. So let's cut those, and then we can look at gluing them in place. Well, we have all of our pieces mitered, and now it's time to glue this assembly together. Now, I'm not going to use any brad nails in this, simply for the fact that I don't want to have to patch holes around. So this is strictly held together with glue. What I'm going to do is, on the inside skeleton, I'm going to apply glue to all these surfaces, as well as the edges here along the outside. And then once I get that done, I'm going to lay my pieces of plywood in place. And then applying glue here, I'm going to glue my hardwood corners in, or my edging in place, and clamp everything together. We're going to want to clamp it both this way across the width to pull in this front. We're going to want to clamp it in kind of a miter frame, and as well we're going to want to put pressure this way on it so that it pulls this sandwich kind of thing all together. And then the shelf will pretty much be, well, almost complete. It'll be a shelf at that point in time. Well, you want to glue it all up like that and let it completely set up, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Now, I'm not going to show you the glue up of this strictly because I really want to concentrate on the glue up. You want to make sure you get all the squeeze out of any areas and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to get into the glue up here. I've explained to you the process. Go ahead and glue up your shelves, guys, and I'll see you when they're dry. Well, it's time now to unclamp our assembly here, our shelf as we've put it together. And truth be told, it's actually been about 2 weeks. Unfortunately, life got in the way and I couldn't get to working on it. So I'm going to take all these clamps off, and then I'll show you how the shelf looks at this point in time. And there we have our shelf unclamped. with the back of it. You can see our openings here for our steel brackets. And now that you've got it all unclamped and it's all glued together, the glue is nice and dry, you want to give it a sanding. Now you don't want to go crazy because remember, this is plywood and that top level is a thin veneer. If you go too crazy, you're going to sand through that veneer. So I'm going to be using a random orbital sander with a 220 grit sandpaper in it, and we're just going to get it nice and smooth. If there's any imperfections, I can feel a little bit of a ridge here, not much. We're going to take that off and sand it all the way around and make it look nice and pretty. We've got all the surfaces sanded, we've got all the edges sanded, the maple is nice and smooth, the plywood is nice and smooth, and there are some projects that just scream for this crisp edge along the corner. This is not one of them in my opinion. I don't like sharp, crisp edges on the edge of shelves. It's just screaming to get cut, especially with that hard maple. I really don't like it. So I'm going to be using a trim router with a 1/8 inch roundover bit, and we're going to put a nice little slight profile on the edge of this, just a 1/8 roundover, just to take that crisp edge off. We've done that 1/8 round over all around the maple edges, leaving the back edge of the plywood still crisp because that's going to be against the wall. I've even routed the 1/8 profile on our mitered corners to soften it because that's what I want it to do. Well now, for all intents and purposes, this shelf is pretty much done, but there's a couple more things that I want to do, and you may want to do the same for your shelf as well. Well, when our brackets get mounted to the wall, of course, there's going to be a screw head here that sticks out of our 1/4 inch holes that we drilled previously in the build. And the problem with that is that it is going to interfere with our pine skeleton of our floating shelf. So what you want to do is place your bracket inside the shelf here. It doesn't have to be perfectly aligned, but you want it pretty close. You've only got 1/8 of an inch play on either side anyway. And then you want to mark the holes where they line up with your skeleton. And what we're going to do is I'm going to be drilling a Forstner bit hole, not very deep, maybe a 1/4 of an inch deep, maybe a little more, whatever strikes my fancy. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill that Forstner bit hole, maybe, you know what, I'm going to use a 5/8 inch Forstner bit just to give me plenty of play and wiggle room for that head of the screw to be able to disappear into that wood so that it's not keeping my shelf out from the wall. And there we have them. And of course our screw heads, when we mount our steel brackets, are just going to sit in there, and you don't have to worry about taking it to a drill press and getting it all square on your project because it's inside. You're never going to see it. So much like we never did any sanding on our skeleton, we really don't need perfect holes here for the countersinks for our hardware. Well, the next step that you want to take is you want to decide what will be the top of your shelf, in this case this, or what will be the bottom. And for me it's this. The reason being there's a few little imperfections in the plywood that I really didn't like, and I want them on the bottom. So place your shelf up on end, and your holes where your steel hardware goes, you want to measure that hole and put a mark roughly at the center of that hole. So for here I have 1.25 inches, So we will put it at 5/8 roughly. You know, it's not super accurate here. So 5/8 in from each hole, we're going to mark our center. And once you get that center marked, lay your shelf down, and on the underside, just take a square and put a light mark, just light, because you're going to want to erase it. A light mark there, right across the bottom of your shelf. Now this is going to be indicating the center of our mounting hardware, our steel brackets. And what I want to do is I want to make it so that we can put a bolt in the bottom of this to keep that shelf from sliding out once we get it done. And for that, we're going to be using 1/4 thread threaded inserts. Now you want to keep in mind that these brackets that go into the shelf are only 8 inches long. So at the 6-inch mark on each one of these lines that we've drawn to the center point, we're going to put a mark in here at 6 inches, and we're going to center punch it and then take it over to the drill press. Now you're going to want to check the size of the bit that you require for your insert. For me, it's an 11/32 bit, and we just want to drill through the top layer of plywood. Don't go any further. You don't want to go through the top of your shelf. So line it up and drill your hole for your insert. And there's one, and we'll just do the second one here. Alright, now that you've got those drilled, remove your layout lines and give it a light sanding just to level out the hole. And now that you have your holes drilled, you want to put your inserts in. Try to keep them as square to the base of your shelf as you can. It can be a little difficult, but screw these inserts into your plywood until they're flush with the base of your shelf. Just like that. You don't want anything protruding out, and you certainly don't want anything sticking out through the inside where your steel bracket goes. Well, here's the concept behind it now. You have your bracket on the wall, and you slide your shelf in, and from the underside now you take a 1/4 thread or whatever style thread of insert that you've chosen, and you basically screw it in just like this to cinch up and tighten up against that steel bracket. You don't have to crank it. It's not, you know, structural. It's just to keep it from vibrating or sliding out. But who the heck wants that? We don't. So what I'm going to do, we have a 1/2 inch thick plywood, and we know we have a 1/8 inch gap between both the plywood and the steel bracket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a 1/2 inch off of these bolts, basically making a headless 1/2 inch long bolt. And then I'm going to use a hacksaw, and I'm going to cut a slot in the end of it so that I can use a thin blade screwdriver and screw it into that slot, having it effectively countersink in by about 1/8 of an inch into the insert, and then it won't be visible, but yet will still be able to be tightened and removed. So I'm going to make one of these, and I'll show you what it looks like when I get them made. And there we have our little retaining bolt that we've made, and you can see in the end we've got the slot cut for our screwdriver. So I've got the bracket in place, and I'll just screw this retaining bolt in place here, trying not to get in the way of the camera. There we go. And we'll just screw this in until it basically meets with that bracket and give it a little torque, just like that. And now that bracket is secured in there. And you can see it lies nice and flush, and it's actually recessed just a touch. And when this is on your wall now, you're not going to have this big ugly bolt sticking out through the bottom of it holding your shelf in place. So there you go. There's your hardware to retain the shelf on your brackets, and it's recessed and makes it nice and pretty and just a little bit more professional. And with our inserts and our set screws made, there is really nothing more to do on this shelf than mount it. So let's head inside the house, and I'll mount one of these and show you how to go about that. Well, here we are inside, and I've decided on my first location for the shelf, and it will be in this area right here. So the first thing you need to do is get a stud finder and find where your studs are, because if you remember, we drilled those holes at 16-inch centers to coincide with the stud or the center of the studs at 16 inches on this wall. Now once you get them marked, of course, just double check with your tape measure and make sure that you're at 16 inches. And we are from here to here at 16 inches on center. So now you want to choose what type of mounting hardware you want to use for your shelving bracket. And for me, I'm going to use a number 10 by 2-inch wood screw. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to use my impact gun. A little overkill, I know. But we're going to use our screw and screw into our one stud, making sure that we get good seating. You don't have to worry too much at this point in time about how level this bracket is. We're going to level it up in just a minute. And there it is, held with one screw. So now we want to level this bracket up. So I've placed a magnetic level on there, and once you're happy with the placement of that, get your other screw and drive it into the stud. And of course, before you say, I'm done, just check it for level and make sure before you really crank it down. It went off a little bit, so I'm going to adjust it and then tighten down all the hardware. Now that you've got your bracket mounted, you just need to take your shelf, line it up with your slots that you put in it to accept your hardware. I'm a little slot challenged here. There we go. Slide it on just like that, and then tighten up those retaining bolts that we made for the underside of it. Everything's tightened down, and I actually put 40 pounds worth of dumbbells on it, and this shelf didn't budge. So it's easily going to hold my scale models, and it will easily hold what you want it to hold. And there we have the first of many scale models on the shelf, and I'm confident that they're going to be safe up there with no chance of that shelf coming down. And there you have it. A heavy-duty floating shelf. Guys, this project was a lot of fun and very functional, especially for me with the scale models that I do and always struggling for a new place to put them. Because I'm making multiples, I have been drawing up little plans as I go so that when it comes time to make more new shelves, I'm not trying to remember what I did. Kind of like in a little shop notes book that I keep here. And it's an idea that you may want to do in your shop as well if you plan on making multiples of these. Guys, it's a lot of fun. The only thing left to do on this project now is to put a couple coats of poly on those shelves just to protect them and keep them looking great for years to come. It's super heavy duty here, guys, and it holds a lot of weight. As you saw in the clip, putting 40 pounds on this thing didn't so much as even budget. None of my models weigh even close to 40 pounds, but I really didn't want a chance having them come off the wall with the hundreds of hours that I put into making them. Guys, I hope you're going to try this project yourself. They look great on the wall, and I'm sure they're going to look great in your home. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.